The sharp metallic click of a cocked Winchester rifle echoed over the howling wind, pressed directly against the center of Silas Carrington's forehead. He couldn't see the weapon, nor could he see the jagged rim of the Montana ravine crumbling beneath his boots, but his heightened senses mapped the danger with terrifying precision. The stench of cheap whiskey on his attacker's breath mingled with the scent of pine and impending rain. One wrong step backward meant a 300-foot drop into the jagged rocks of the Bitterroot Valley. Silas stood perfectly frozen, his pale, unseeing blue eyes staring blankly into the storm. His fingers tightened around his heavy hickory cane. He didn't blink. He didn't tremble. In the suffocating darkness of his world, death was just another shadow waiting to swallow him whole. 5 years ago, Silas would have disarmed the man in a heartbeat. He had been the undisputed king of the Bitterroot frontier, a formidable, broad-shouldered rancher whose physical prowess was matched only by his sharp intellect. His family's legacy, the massive Loxley Ranch, stretched across thousands of acres of prime Montana territory. But a horrific wagon crash in a treacherous mountain pass had crushed his optic nerves, plunging him into permanent absolute darkness. The tragedy did more than steal his sight. It stripped away his future. His fiancée, Caroline, a woman who loved his vast wealth and towering status, but loathed the reality of a broken man, abandoned him within a month. She packed her silk dresses and returned to the comforts of Chicago, leaving Silas in a self-imposed purgatory. Bitter, resentful, and deeply wounded, Silas retreated into the grand shadowed timber lodge of Loxley Ranch. He locked his gates, turned away his friends, and gave up on the world, unaware that his isolation was creating a dangerous vacuum that the corrupt forces of the valley were eager to exploit. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in the cobblestone streets of Boston, another cage was shattering. Beatrice Stanhope sat in the back of a rain-soaked carriage, her hands tightly gripping a single worn leather valise. At 28, she possessed a striking aristocratic beauty that had inspired sonnets and fueled the bitterest envy among the elite. For 3 seasons, she had been Boston's most coveted prize-drawing proposals from wealthy industrialists and high society heirs. They saw her as a beautiful ornament to grace their parlors. Yet Beatrice remained fiercely unmarried, possessing an independent mind that terrified ordinary men. But high society was a fickle beast. In October of 1878, the sudden spectacular collapse of the Union Financial Bank sent shockwaves through the American economy. Beatrice's father, Lord Richard Stanhope, had invested every dime of the family fortune into the bank's fraudulent railway bonds. Overnight, the Stanhope name was financially annihilated. The shock was too much for her father's fragile heart. He succumbed to a fatal attack within days, leaving Beatrice entirely alone to face a mountain of debts. The very suitors who had once begged for her hand suddenly looked the other way. Worse, some offered her positions as a glorified kept mistress under the hypocritical guise of charity. Refusing to sell her dignity to the vultures of Boston, Beatrice made a radical choice. She gathered her remaining modest belongings, packed her bags, and boarded a westbound train, trading the false security of the gilded cage for the brutal honesty of the western frontier. Her destination was Rosewood Cabin, a derelict, isolated property tucked away on the northern edge of the Bitterroot Valley, left to her by her eccentric late Aunt Agatha. When the stagecoach finally dropped her off, the reality of her new life hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was small and tattered, its timber logs weathered to a ghostly gray, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. The surrounding prairie was wild, choked with weeds, and guarded by the towering, indifferent peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The wind here didn't whisper. It roared. Yet as Beatrice stepped onto the creaking porch, she felt a strange sense of liberation. There were no gossiping matrons here, no transactional suitors, no artificial rules. She unbuttoned her heavy traveling coat, rolled up her sleeves, and looked out over the vast expanse of the valley. She knew that survival would require her to sweat to bleed and to rouse a strength she never knew she possessed. What she did not know was that this wild land held secrets far deeper than the soil. As night fell over Montana, Beatrice lit a single candle inside the drafty cabin. The floorboards groaned beneath her boats as she began to clear away years of accumulated dust and cobwebs. Her mind wandered to the rumors she had heard at the town's general store earlier that afternoon, whispers of a cursed blind ghost who ruled the neighboring Loxley Ranch, a man named Silas Carrington, who was supposedly losing his mind in the dark. The locals spoke of him with a mixture of fear and pity. But Beatrice felt neither. She knew what it was like to be discarded by the world. While wiping down the grease-stained walls near the old stone fireplace, her cloth caught on a loose piece of molding. Curiosity piqued, she pulled at the wood. It gave way with a sharp splintering sound, revealing a deep, hollow cavity hidden inside the chimney breast. Reaching her hand into the darkness, her fingers brushed against something cold, heavy, and metallic. With a slow, deliberate effort, Beatrice dragged a rusted iron lockbox into the dim candlelight. The metal was pitted with age, and a heavy, archaic padlock held it securely shut. Her heart began to beat with a steady, rhythmic urgency. This was not a standard pioneer's cash box. It was an antique, reinforced vault of secrets left behind by Aunt Agatha, a woman who had served as the private librarian and accountant for the eccentric patriarchs of the valley. As Beatrice searched the cabin for something to force the lock, the omniscient eye of fate drew an invisible line between her lonely cabin and the grand, dark lodge of Locksley Ranch. Silas Carrington had survived his encounter on the ridge that morning by sheer instinct, but the wolves were closing in on him. Thomas Arbuthnot, the slick local banker, was already forging the documents that would declare the blind rancher incompetent, preparing to seize the land. But neither the banker nor Silas knew that miles away, a ruined city girl was about to break open a box that contained the true hidden history of the Carrington Empire, and a map that would either save them both or seal their fates in blood. With a heavy iron poker, Beatrice struck the rusted padlock. The metal groaned, the rivets popped, and the lid creaked open, exhaling the scent of old paper, melted wax, and a secret that had waited 40 years to be found. Beatrice wiped her brow with the back of a soot-stained sleeve, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared into the open iron lockbox. The candle flamed low, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters across the rough-hewn log walls of Rosewood Cabin. Inside the box lay 3 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed by time and edged with the faint, sweet scent of dried tobacco and aged parchment. These were the private ledgers of Aunt Agatha, a woman whom the town remembered as a quiet, eccentric spinster, but whom these pages revealed to be an incredibly astute keeper of dangerous secrets. As Beatrice carefully lifted the first ledger, a loose piece of heavy vellum slid out, fluttering onto the dust-covered floorboards. She knelt to retrieve it, smoothing out the creases under the weak amber light. It was a hand-drawn map of the Bitterroot Valley dating back to 1844. The topography was precise, marked by lines that dictated property boundaries that had long since changed. But it was the neat crimson ink annotations in the margins that caused Beatrice's breath to hitch. Her eyes scanned the elegant, sharp handwriting of her late aunt, tracking a series of financial records that defied everything the local history books claimed about the founding of the territory. According to the entries, Alistair Carrington, the brilliant and deeply paranoid patriarch who had built the foundation of Locksley Ranch, had foreseen the catastrophic banking panic that devastated the young American nation in the mid-1840s. Distrusting the federal government and fearing the total collapse of paper currency, Alistair had quietly liquidated his massive shares in the East Coast shipping lines and Western fur monopolies. He didn't reinvest the money. Instead, he systematically converted his wealth into raw silver bullion, unregistered East India bearer bonds, and over 100,000 gold eagle coins. The journals detailed the exact weight, the dates of transfer, and the clandestine shipments that arrived in the valley under the guise of agricultural machinery. Beatrice leaned back against the sturdy brick chimney, her mind racing with the sharp financial logic she had inherited from her father. A fortune of that magnitude would be worth millions in 1881. It was enough to buy entire cities, to alter the political landscape of the territory, or to save a failing empire. Yet the final pages of the journal took a dark, ominous turn. Alistair had died of a sudden, massive stroke in the winter of 1846, leaving no will and taking the exact location of his subterranean vault to his grave. His descendants had searched the ranch for decades, eventually dismissing the legendary gold as the senile hallucinations of an old man. But Agatha's journals proved the gold was real. More importantly, Agatha had spent the last years of her life decoding Alistair's private papers, leaving behind a trail of riddles that pointed directly to a specific forgotten sector of the Carrington land. The weight of this discovery pressed heavily on Beatrice's chest. She realized she was holding the key to a kingdom, but it was a kingdom currently surrounded by wolves. Her mind flashed back to the tense gossip she had overheard at the town dry goods store. The local banker, Thomas Arbuthnot, was moving quickly to seize Loxley Ranch, using the blind and isolated Silas Carrington's vulnerability against him. If Arbuthnot obtained the land, he would undoubtedly uncover the secret sooner or later. The realization triggered a deep protective instinct within her. She had watched the ruthless businessmen of Boston strip her father of his dignity and his life using legal technicalities and forged debts. She would not sit quietly and watch the same tragedy play out in this beautiful wild valley, even if the victim was a bitter, hostile stranger who had nearly had a rifle bullet put through his forehead that very morning. With a determined set of her jaw, Beatrice blew out the candle and retreated to her modest cot. But sleep eluded her. Every creak of the cabin's timbers sounded like footsteps, and the howling Montana wind seemed to whisper the names of Alistair, Silas, and Arbuthnot. She knew that her survival on this frontier was no longer just about enduring the harsh winters or repairing a sagging roof. She had inadvertently stepped into a high-stakes game of chess, and her next move would require her to cross the very boundaries that Silas Carrington had warned her never to breach again. When the first gray light of dawn broke over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, Beatrice was already awake. She traded her nightgown for a practical heavy wool flannel shirt, a thick canvas skirt, and her sturdiest leather riding boots. She carefully wrapped Aunt Agatha's ledgers in a waterproof oilskin cloth, tucking them securely into the deep pockets of her heavy winter coat. She didn't possess a carriage or a horse yet, but the independent spirit that had sustained her through the ruin of Boston filled her veins with a cold, focused adrenaline. She stepped out onto the frost-dusted porch, the crisp, biting mountain air filling her lungs as she looked toward the imposing, dark timberline that marked the edge of Loxley Ranch. The walk across the valley was grueling. The autumn grass was frozen and sharp, crunching loudly beneath her boots, and the vastness of the landscape made her feel incredibly small. Yet she kept her eyes fixed on the distant columns of smoke rising from the Grand Carrington Lodge. As she approached the perimeter, she noticed the neglected state of the property. Fences were splintered, and down irrigation ditches were choked with weeds, and the cattle she spotted in the distance looked thin and poorly managed. It was a stark contrast to the legendary wealth described in the journals, confirming her suspicion that Thomas Arbuthnot's management was a deliberate act of sabotage designed to ruin Silas completely. Beatrice reached the collapsed wooden gate that marked the northern boundary, the very spot where Silas had stood frozen against the storm the previous day. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs as she scanned the mist-shrouded pines. She knew the danger she was walking into. Silas Carrington was a man trapped in a prison of permanent darkness, his temper volatile and his trust entirely shattered by the betrayal of his past. He had a dog that would tear an intruder apart and a rifle he could fire by sound alone. But Beatrice also knew that he was the rightful heir to the secrets in her pocket, and the only man strong enough to help her defeat the corruption creeping over the valley. She took a deep, steadying breath, gripped the oilskin package in her pocket, and stepped over the broken boundary line. As her boots sank into the damp crimson soil of Loxley Ranch, a low, menacing growl vibrated through the dense morning fog, signaling that the ghost of the ridge was already aware of her intrusion. The low, rumbling growl vibrated through the dense morning fog, a sound so deep it felt like it was rising from the frozen earth itself. Beatrice froze her hand instinctively, pressing against the oilskin package tucked inside her heavy coat pocket. Through the shifting gray veil of the Montana mist, the massive muscular frame of Barnaby, the blue heeler cattle dog, materialized. His ears were pinned back, his silver and blue coat bristling with hostility, and his dark eyes were locked entirely on her. He didn't bark. He was a working dog trained to corner and destroy threats on the perimeter of Loxley Ranch. "Easy, boy," Beatrice murmured, her voice steady and deliberate, refusing to let the trembling in her chest manifest in her tone. She had faced the sharpest tongues in the ballrooms of Boston, and she refused to be intimidated by a hound in the wilderness. She kept her hands visible, palm open, standing perfectly still as the dog advanced, bearing yellowed fangs. "I told you to stay across the fence, city girl," a gravelly, dangerous voice cut through the silence. Out of the fog stepped Silas Carrington. He looked even more imposing than he had the previous day. He wore a heavy, fleece-lined leather coat that accentuated his broad shoulders, and his dark hair was dusted with early morning frost. In his right hand he held his heavy hickory cane, using it to navigate the uneven terrain with a fluid, haunting familiarity. His left hand rested casually on the frame of his Winchester rifle slung over his shoulder. His striking pale blue eyes were wide and unseeing, staring directly past her left shoulder. Yet his head was tilted, his ears tuning into the rhythm of her breath and the rustle of her canvas skirt. "Your fences are down, Mr. Carrington," Beatrice replied smoothly, her Boston accent cutting through the crisp mountain air like a silver blade. "Technically, I'm standing on neutral ground, and if you trained your dog as poorly as you maintain your borders, I would already be dead." Silas let out a cold, mocking laugh, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "You've got a sharp tongue for a squatter rotting in Agatha's old cabin, Barnaby Heel." At the command, the massive dog instantly ceased his growling and dropped back to Silas's side, though his eyes never left Beatrice. Silas advanced a few steps, his cane striking a buried stone with a sharp click. "You're a long way from the brick townhouses of the East, Miss Stanhope. This isn't a place for morning strolls. Turn around before the frost bites through those pretty leather boots." "I didn't walk 3 miles through the freezing brush to discuss my footwear," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a firm, serious register. She took a step forward, deliberate and slow, ensuring the crunch of her boots gave Silas ample warning. "I came here because your house is on fire, Silas, and you are sitting in the dark pretending you can't smell the smoke." Silas's face hardened, the faint scar across his temple tightening. He hated pity and he loathed intrusion. "If you're here to offer charity or neighborly advice, save your breath. I don't need a broken socialite telling me how to manage my land." "I'm not offering charity. I am offering you the truth," she countered, stepping closer until she could see the frost on his eyelashes. The scent of lavender and mountain rain drifted toward him, an intoxicating contrast to the smell of pine and leather he was accustomed to. "Thomas Arbuthnot is systematically robbing you blind. He is falsifying your cattle yields, telling you the ranch is bleeding money, while he sells your timber and grazing rights to out-of-state monopolies. He is setting a trap to force this ranch into a bank liquidation by the end of the week." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ridge. Silas stood perfectly rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles bunched beneath his stubble. For 5 years he had lived in total isolation, trusting only the ledgers Arbuthnot brought to his table. Ledgers he had to rely on others to read for him. The accusation struck at the rawest nerve of his pride. To admit she was right meant admitting he was helpless, a blind man mocked by the very people he had trusted. "Arbuthnot was my father's protégé," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, repressed fury. "He has managed the financial books since the day I lost my sight. You expect me to believe the word of a ruined city girl over a man who has kept this ranch afloat while I lived in purgatory? You know nothing of this valley." "I know how vultures operate, Mr. Carrington," Beatrice said, her voice softening with a rare, genuine empathy that caught him off guard. "I watched the finest businessmen in Boston smile at my father while they signed the papers that destroyed his life. Arbuthnot isn't keeping you afloat. He is drowning you slowly so you won't struggle when he pulls you under." Silas raised his hickory cane, pointing the brass tip directly at her chest, his precision terrifying for a man who could not see. "Get off my land, Miss Stanhope. If I catch you whispering these conspiracies in the town or on my perimeter again, I won't call Barnaby off. My blindness doesn't make me weak, and it certainly doesn't make me foolish." Beatrice looked down at the brass cane, then up at his furious, tragic face. She realized that logic alone would not break through the fortress of his pride. She needed to give him a reason to fight a piece of reality he could not dismiss as city gossip. "I am leaving," Beatrice said quietly, refusing to show fear. "But before I go, I want you to consider one thing. Why is a small-town banker like Arbuthnot buying up old unrecorded debts from the East Coast? Why is he so desperate to legally declare you incompetent by Friday?" She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the oilskin cloth. She chose not to reveal the journals yet. He was too volatile, too defensive. She needed him to doubt his surroundings first. "Look at your own cattle, Silas. Listen to the emptiness of your northern pastures. The land doesn't lie, even if your banker does." She turned on her heel, her heavy skirt swirling against the frosted grass as she began the long walk back toward Rosewood Cabin. Silas remained frozen on the ridge, his pale eyes staring blankly into the fog long after the scent of lavender had faded. His thinned lips moved silently, his mind violently dissecting her words. He could hear the distant hollow echo of his empty pastures, a detail he had ignored in his grief. As Beatrice disappeared into the timberline, the omniscient eye of the valley watched the storm clouds gather over the mountains. The seeds of doubt had been deeply planted in the blind rancher's mind. Silas turned back toward his dark, lonely lodge, his grip on his cane tighter than ever, unaware that Thomas Arbuthnot's hired men were already watching the perimeter, preparing a far more violent response to the independent woman who threatened to unearth their million-dollar secret. The morning frost had melted into a dreary, slate-gray afternoon by the time Beatrice reached the outskirts of the valley's main settlement, a rugged frontier outpost known as Oak Haven. Hitching posts lined the muddy main thoroughfare, and the sharp, rhythmic tang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed through the crisp air. Beatrice adjusted the collar of her heavy coat, her fingers subtly confirming the presence of Aunt Agatha's oilskin-wrapped journals. She needed data-concrete proof that would bridge the gap between her aunt's historical records and the economic reality of 1881. To defeat a man like Thomas Arbuthnot, she had to understand his ledger books better than he did. She walked with a quiet aristocratic grace that drew curious lingering glances from the rugged townspeople. They saw an elegant city woman, but beneath that refined exterior lay the razor-sharp mind of a businessman's daughter. Beatrice began her investigation at the county land registry, a cramped, dust-choked office smelling of damp paper and stale ink. Paying the clerk a silver coin, she requested the public records for the Bitterroot Valley's agricultural outputs and land transfers over the past 3 years. As she sat in the corner of the office turning the heavy parchment pages, the omniscient perspective of the story reveals her brilliant analytical mind at work. The numbers on the official county ledgers did not lie, but they certainly did not align with what Arbuthnot was telling Silas. According to the public records, the northern grazing pastures of Loxley Ranch were listed as quarantined and barren due to blackleg disease, a severe bacterial infection that would render the cattle worthless. Because of this supposed blight, the ranch's recorded income had plummeted by nearly 70%. However, Beatrice's sharp eyes caught a glaring contradiction. Just 2 pages later, under the timber and shipping registry, a massive shipment of prime, grass-fed beef had been logged as exported from the very same northern coordinates of Loxley Ranch. The buyer was a wealthy railroad conglomerate based in Chicago, and the payment had been processed not through the Loxley estate account, but through a private holding company called Valley Development Corporation. Beatrice leaned back, her blood turning cold as the final pieces of Arbuthnot's sinister puzzle fell into place. The blackleg disease was a complete fabrication. The cattle were healthy, thriving, and being sold for record profits. Arbuthnot was systematically hoarding the ranch's legitimate earnings into his dummy corporation, leaving the blind, Silas, to believe his family heritage was rotting from disease. By starving the estate of liquid cash, Arbuthnot was creating an artificial mountain of debt, forcing a legal foreclosure. Once the court declared Silas incompetent due to his physical affliction and financial ruin on Friday, Arbuthnot's holding company would step in as the sole bidder, acquiring thousands of acres of land and the hidden Alistair Carrington gold for pennies on the dollar. Leaving the registry office, Beatrice walked toward the town's general store to purchase basic provisions, her mind violently dissecting the legal mechanics of the fraud. As she crossed the boardwalk, the sharp creak of expensive leather upholstery caught her attention. A pristine, black-varnished carriage imported from the East Coast and entirely out of place in the muddy frontier pulled up to the local bank. The carriage door opened and Thomas Arbuthnot stepped out. He was an impeccably groomed man in his late 30s, wearing a tailored wool overcoat and a polished silk top hat. He exuded the smooth, predatory confidence of a politician. To the desperate homesteaders tipping their hats to him on the street, he was the benevolent financier keeping the valley alive. But the omniscient eye sees the rot beneath the velvet coat. Arbuthnot's fingers were heavy with gold rings, and his pocket watch chain was made of solid, unblemished silver extravagances far beyond the legitimate salary of a small-town territory banker. Behind Arbuthnot stepped a towering, brutal-looking man named Cobb. Cobb wore a stained canvas duster, his hand resting heavily on the grip of a Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He was Arbuthnot's shadow, a ruthless enforcer known for ensuring that disgruntled ranchers who questioned the bank's mathematical calculations quietly packed their bags and left the state. Beatrice stood in the shadows of the general store's awning, watching them closely. As Arbuthnot turned to enter the bank, his sharp, dark eyes swept across the boardwalk, pausing for a fraction of a second on Beatrice. A cold, calculating smirk touched the banker's lips. He didn't know about Aunt Agatha's journals yet, but his spies had already informed him that the new spinster living in Rosewood Cabin had broken the perimeter of Loxley Ranch that morning to speak with the blind recluse. To Arbuthnot, Beatrice was an annoying variable, an educated city woman who might possess enough financial literacy to complicate his Friday deadline. Entering the general store, Beatrice kept her head down, her heart hammering with a mixture of anger and urgency. She listened to the murmurs of the local farmers leaning against the counter. They were complaining about the sudden spike in land taxes and the ruthlessness of the bank's foreclosures. "Arbuthnot's buying up everything from here to the ridge," the storekeeper muttered, tossing a sack of flour onto the counter. "Says it's for the progress of the railroad, but it feels like he's squeezing the life out of us. Even Silas Carrington's place is going under. If a man with that much land can't survive, what chance do the rest of us have?" Beatrice paid for her salt and coffee, her silence masking the fierce determination burning in her chest. The corruption in the valley was a spreading disease, and Silas Carrington was the patient zero. He was completely vulnerable, barricaded inside his grief and darkness, utterly oblivious to the fact that his father's trusted protege was preparing to strip his family name from the history of Montana. She walked out of the store, the heavy gray clouds lowering over the jagged peaks, threatening a violent autumn storm. She knew her time had officially run out. It was Wednesday afternoon. In less than 48 hours, the circuit judge would arrive in Oakhaven to sign the foreclosure and incompetence papers. She had the mathematical proof of fraud in her mind, and she had Alistair's coded map in her pocket, but she could not fight the legal system alone. She needed the blind master of Loxley Ranch to look past his shattered pride, to trust a stranger, and to pull his rifle from its sleeve. Bandy-legged shadows lengthened across the valley as Beatrice began her swift trek back toward the northern ridge, unaware that behind her Cobb was already unhitching his horse, a sinister order from Arbuthnot burning in his mind to ensure the city girl didn't survive to see the morning light. The storm finally broke over the Bitterroot Valley, just as Beatrice reached the iron-wrought gates of Loxley Ranch, its fury transforming the dirt roads into a quagmire of freezing mud. Lightning ripped across the black sky, illuminating the grand timber lodge that sat like a forgotten fortress on the hill. Beatrice did not knock. She pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping inside the grand foyer as sheets of rain lashed at her back. She slammed the door shut against the howling wind, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. In the center of the vast, shadow-drenched parlor, Silas Carrington sat by a dying fire. He didn't turn his head, but his nostrils flared immediately, catching the sharp, unmistakable scent of lavender and mountain rain. "You're either incredibly brave or exceptionally foolish, Miss Stanhope," Silas said, his deep voice slicing through the crackle of the embers. "I believe I made my thoughts on your trespassing entirely clear this morning." "Your thoughts are irrelevant when your executioner is standing at the door, Silas," Beatrice replied, her voice firm despite her shivering frame. She strode past the expensive, dust-covered furniture, her boots leaving a trail of wet mud on the fine Persian rugs. She marched straight to the heavy mahogany table near his chair and pulled the oilskin-wrapped package from her coat, slamming it down with a heavy, deliberate thud. "I don't have time for your pride, and you don't have time to play the tragic hermit. Look at this. Or rather, let me show you what you've been refusing to see." Silas stood up, his towering frame casting a massive shadow across the room. He gripped his hickory cane tightly, his jaw clenched in defensive anger. "I do not appreciate your dramatic, city girl. I told you. Thomas Arbuthnot has falsified your county records." Beatrice interrupted, her tone sharp and clinical as she unbuttoned her wet coat. "I spent the afternoon at the Oakhaven registry. He has officially logged your northern pastures as blighted with blackleg disease. He told you the cattle died, but the shipping logs tell a completely different story. Hundreds of head of grass-fed Loxley beef were shipped to Chicago last month under a dummy corporation called Valley Development. Arbuthnot is stealing your profits, creating a false debt on your estate, and by Friday, the circuit judge will legally declare you financially ruined and mentally incompetent." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He stood perfectly still, his pale, unseeing blue eyes staring into the dark void of the room as his mind violently processed the legal reality of her words. The omniscient perspective reveals the sudden terrifying fracturing of his reality. The man he had trusted to protect his family's honor was the very monster digging his grave. "Friday." Silas whispered the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. "That is less than 48 hours. "Exactly," Beatrice said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his broad shoulders. "He wants you isolated. He wants you broken. Because as long as you are hiding in this dark house, you won't notice that he is trying to steal the true heritage of your family." She reached into the oilskin cloth and opened Aunt Agatha's first journal, her fingers tracing the elegant handwriting. "Your grandfather, Alistair Carrington, didn't die penniless, Silas. He hid over 100,000 gold eagle coins and raw silver bullion on this ranch before his stroke in 1846. My Aunt Agatha spent her life decoding his private journals. The gold is real, and Arbuthnot knows it." Silas lowered his cane, his hand trembling slightly as a wave of intense vulnerability washed over him. For 5 years he had allowed his blindness to become his prison, believing he was a useless relic of a bygone era. But hearing this elegant, fierce woman speak with such absolute certainty ignited a dormant, lethal fire in his veins. She wasn't looking at him with the pathetic sympathy of the townspeople. She was looking at him as an equal, a fellow soldier in a war for survival. "Why are you doing this?" Silas asked, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp. He reached out blindly, his large, calloused hand hovering in the space between them until his fingers brushed the soft fabric of her sleeve. "You owe nothing to this valley. You owe nothing to me. A woman with your mind could take this information and sell it to the highest bidder in Chicago." Beatrice looked down at his hand, a sudden warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "Because I know what it feels like to watch a good man get destroyed by parasites, Silas," she said softly, her voice thick with old sorrow. "They did it to my father in Boston. They took everything from him while he smiled and shook their hands, and the shock killed him. I couldn't save him, but I can save you, and I can help you take back what belongs to your name." Silas's fingers tightened around her arm, not with aggression, but with a profound, sudden understanding. The walls of his self-imposed purgatory began to crumble. "Agatha's journals," he murmured, his tactical mind instantly kicking into gear. "You say she decoded the locations. She left Riddle's topographical coordinates that match the old boundaries," Beatrice explained quickly, pulling the hand-drawn vellum map from the box and spreading it across the mahogany table. "I have the numbers, Silas. I have the financial literacy to read the clues, but I don't know the terrain. I don't know how the land shifts when the winter snow hits, and I don't know where Alistair would have built a subterranean vault." A dark, dangerous smile finally touched Silas's lips, transforming his tragic countenance into that of the formidable frontier king he used to be. "I don't need eyes to see this ranch, Miss Stanhope," he said, his voice ringing with a new, powerful authority. "I ran these ridges since I was a boy of 7. I know every rock, every ravine, every abandoned timber shaft by the rhythm of the wind and the texture of the soil." He guided her hand to the table, his fingers tracing a path over the paper. "Bring the wooden grid board from the study. We have 48 hours to solve my grandfather's puzzle, and if Thomas Arbuthnot wants a war for this valley, we are going to give him one." As the thunder shook the foundation of the lodge, the two outcasts leaned over the table, their heads close, as Beatrice began to read the first cryptic entry aloud. The alliance was forged in the heart of the storm, a perfect symbiosis of her sight and his spatial memory. But outside, hidden beneath the shadows of the dripping pine trees, a dark figure on horseback adjusted his oilskin coat, watching the golden light streaming from the lodge windows before riding back toward town to deliver a fatal warning to his employer. The relentless rhythm of the mountain thunderstorm battered the thick timber walls of Rosewood Cabin, creating a deafening roar that mirrored the turbulence in Beatrice's mind. It was late Thursday afternoon. For the past 24 hours, she and Silas had worked in feverish, silent synchronization, combining Aunt Agatha's coded financial ledgers with his flawless tactile map of the valley. They had narrowed the location of Alistair Carrington's hidden gold down to a single forgotten sector on the eastern edge of the ranch. But as Beatrice walked back to her cabin to gather the final set of original notebooks, a cold sense of dread settled deep in her stomach. The air felt heavy, charged with a danger that had nothing to do with the lightning splitting the sky. She pushed open the cabin door, stepping inside the dark, unlit parlor. She instantly froze. The familiar scent of dust and pine had been replaced by the pungent, expensive aroma of imported Turkish tobacco. "You look wet, Miss Stanhope," a smooth, cultured voice remarked from the shadows near the fireplace. Thomas Arbuthnot sat comfortably in her late aunt's rocking chair, a silver pocket watch cradled in his manicured hand. The golden glow of a small oil lamp illuminated his tailored wool suit, casting a sharp contrast against the rustic, leaking cabin. Standing directly behind him, leaning his massive frame against the timber doorway, was Cobb. The enforcer's hand rested casually on the checkered grip of his holstered Colt revolver, his cold eyes tracking Beatrice's every movement like a hawk watching a field mouse. Beatrice did not run. She stood tall, chin lifted, channeled the regal defiance of her Boston heritage despite the water dripping from her canvas coat. "You are trespassing, Mr. Arbuthnot, and in Montana, I believe that is a legal justification for a bullet." Arbuthnot chuckled softly, the sound thin and devoid of warmth. "The law is a flexible instrument, my dear. It belongs to those who know how to author it." He rose from the chair, the silver watch snapping shut with a sharp, definitive click. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "I've spent the last 2 days observing your sudden interest in the blind recluse up on the hill. A ruined city girl, and a broken cripple whispering in the dark. It's almost touching, but unfortunately your little crusade is interfering with my schedule." "I know about the shipping logs, Thomas," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a dangerous icy register. "I know about the Valley Development Corporation. I know there is no blackleg disease in the northern pastures. You are a thief, and by tomorrow morning the circuit judge will know it too." Arbuthnot's smirk did not fade. Instead, it deepened into something deeply reptilian. "The circuit judge is a very reasonable man who happens to owe his seat to my bank's campaign contributions. Do you truly think he will take the word of an impoverished spinster over an official county ledger signed by the town's chief financier?" He reached into his breast pocket and drew out a sheaf of heavy-stamped legal documents, tossing them carelessly onto the wooden table. "I didn't come here to argue mathematics with you, Beatrice. I came to present an ultimatum." Beatrice glanced at the papers. Her eyes, trained in the brutal legalities of the Boston financial crash, instantly recognized the headers. "My father's debts," she whispered, her face losing its color. "Precisely," Arbuthnot sneered. "When the Stanhope estate collapsed in Boston, your father's outstanding liabilities were sold to Eastern collection agencies for pennies. My holding company purchased those notes last winter. As of this moment, you legally owe my bank $4,000. A sum I know you do not possess." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and mint. "In Montana, the law allows for the immediate incarceration of fraudulent debtors. If you are still in this valley by tomorrow morning, Cobb here will personally escort you to the state penitentiary in Helena. You will rot in a stone cell for the next 10 years. Cobb shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking ominously in the small room. "However," Arbuthnot continued, his voice shifting back into a polite theatrical purr, "I am a gentleman. There is a westbound stagecoach leaving Oakhaven at dawn. If you are on it, your debts will be permanently erased. You can go back to Boston or Chicago or wherever ruined beauties go to fade away. Leave Silas to his darkness. He is a relic of the past, and his land belongs to the future." The omniscient eye tracks the violent collision of emotions inside Beatrice's chest. The threat was terrifyingly real. Arbuthnot had the legal system rigged, the money to back it up, and a ruthless enforcer ready to destroy her. Flight was the logical choice. It was the choice her father would have begged her to make to save herself. But as she looked at Arbuthnot's smug, arrogant face, she saw the exact same monsters who had driven her father into an early grave. If she ran now, she would be running for the rest of her life, leaving another good man to be devoured by parasites. "The stagecoach leaves at dawn, Mr. Arbuthnot," Beatrice said, her voice dropping all traces of trembling, hardening into pure, unyielding granite. "I suggest you and your hound make sure your bags are packed, because I'm not leaving this valley." Arbuthnot's eyes narrowed into slits, the polite facade dissolving to reveal the ruthless criminal beneath. "You've made a fatal mistake, city girl," he hissed. He turned toward the door, gesturing to his enforcer. "Let's go, Cobb. Miss Stanhope clearly needs a few hours in the cold to reconsider the value of her freedom. If she isn't at the station by sunrise, execute the warrant." The two men stepped out into the raging storm, slamming the door behind them. The cabin fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of Beatrice's heart. She didn't waste a single second. She marched to the fireplace, ripped away the loose molding, and grabbed Aunt Agatha's final journal. Wrapping it securely in her waterproof oilskin, she threw her coat back over her wet shoulders. She did not wait for the dawn. She did not pack her clothes. She sprinted out into the blinding sheets of rain, her boots sinking deep into the mud as she ran with reckless, desperate speed toward the northern ridge of Loxley Ranch. Lightning shattered the sky, illuminating her solitary figure against the vast, hostile wilderness. She needed to reach Silas. Arbuthnot was desperate, which meant he was moving his timeline forward. The final battle for the valley was no longer happening on Friday. It was happening tonight in the heart of the absolute darkness, and they had to find the gold before the vultures came to take it by force. The freezing sheets of rain felt like needles against Beatrice's face as she sprinted across the eastern boundary of Loxley Ranch, her boots sinking deep into the treacherous mud. She didn't look back to see if Cobb was pursuing her. Her mind was entirely locked on the coordinates she and Silas had verified just hours before. The oilskin-wrapped journal pressed against her ribs was a solid, comforting weight, a tangible anchor in the middle of the chaotic wilderness. When she finally burst through the doors of the Grand Timber Lodge, she found Silas waiting in the dark foyer, wearing his rugged leather duster, his Winchester rifle slung over his shoulder, and his heavy hickory cane gripped tightly in his right hand. He didn't ask if she was all right. His heightened thinsulate hearing had already tracked the frantic, uneven rhythm of her breath and the squelch of her saturated boots. "Arbuthnot knows!" Beatrice gasped, her lungs burning from the icy air. "He came to my cabin. He bought my father's old debts from the East Coast and threatened to throw me in the state penitentiary by morning if I don't leave the valley. Silas, he is desperate. He's moving the timeline forward. We have to find the vault tonight." Silas didn't blink, his pale, unseeing eyes fixed on the empty space ahead, but his jaw hardened into stone. "The eastern edge," he growled, his deep voice carrying a terrifyingly calm authority. "The old limestone ice house dug deep beneath the foundations of the abandoned stone barn. It's the only place on this ranch where the winter chill is preserved all year round. My grandfather built it in 1840 before the banking panic. Follow me, Beatrice. In this storm, your eyes are useless anyway. Trust my steps." They stepped out into the raging blizzard of rain and wind, heading toward the derelict structure that loomed like a skeletal titan on the edge of the property. Silas navigated the sloping rocky terrain with a fluid, haunting precision that defied his blindness. He knew exactly where the earth dipped, where the exposed pine roots waited to trip an unwary walker, and where the mud was shallow enough to afford traction. Beatrice gripped the sleeve of his heavy duster, allowing him to pull her through the blinding sheets of water. The sheer physical power and unyielding confidence of the man filled her with a profound sense of safety that she hadn't felt since before her father's death. They reached the cavernous interior of the abandoned stone barn, the wind howling through the shattered rafters above. Silas led her to the rear of the structure, where a massive rusted iron grate was set directly into the stone floor, choked with decades of dead vines and debris. Silas jammed the brass tip of his heavy cane into the latch, using his leverage to wrench the grate upward with a deafening screech of metal. Below them, a steep flight of narrow stone steps descended into an absolute suffocating darkness that smelled of damp limestone iron and ancient untouched dust. "Light the lantern, Beatrice," Silas whispered, his ears twitching as he monitored the ambient sounds of the barn behind them. "But keep the wick low. We aren't alone in this valley." Beatrice struck a match, her hand steady as she transferred the flame to the small oil lamp she had carried from the lodge. The weak amber glow illuminated the moss-covered steps as they descended deep into the subterranean belly of the ranch. At the bottom of the stairs, they encountered a reinforced iron door secured by a massive archaic chain that had resisted the dampness of the earth for nearly 40 years. Beatrice stepped forward, pulling Aunt Agatha's journal from her pocket and flipping to the final page. "The riddle says, the combination to the lock is the year the foundation was laid reversed." Beatrice read aloud, her eyes scanning the handwritten notes. 1840, reversed 0481. Silas reached out his large, sensitive fingers, finding the cold dials of the heavy iron padlock. With 4 precise metallic clicks, the ancient mechanism yielded the heavy shackles, dropping to the stone floor with an echoing clang. Silas threw his shoulder against the iron door, forcing it open with a groan of protesting hinges. Beatrice lifted the lantern high, and the weak light fractured against a sight that took her breath away. Neatly stacked against the far wall were dozens of heavy wooden crates, their lids branded with the seal of the United States Mint. One of the rotting crates had split open, spilling a cascading waterfall of solid gold eagle coins, brilliant silver bullion bars, and glittering raw sapphires onto the limestone floor. Alistair Carrington's legendary fortune was real, and it was entirely intact. "A truly magnificent discovery, Miss Stanhope," a cold, cultured voice echoed from the top of the stairs. "I must thank you for saving my men the trouble of excavating the entire property." Thomas Arbuthnot stepped into the chamber. A slick, mocking smile plastered across his handsome face. He held a silver-plated revolver aimed squarely at Silas's chest. Directly behind him, Cobb descended the steps, his face bruised from his morning encounter on the ridge, his own weapon drawn and ready. The banker looked at the glittering gold on the floor, his dark eyes burning with an insatiable manic greed. "You found it," Arbuthnot whispered, his voice trembling with dark satisfaction. "The Carrington Empire. By tomorrow morning this land will belong to my holding company, and the two of you will be nothing more than a tragic footnote. A blind man and a disgraced city girl who wandered into a collapsed, forgotten cellar during the worst storm of the century. It's an airtight narrative." Cobb stepped forward, cocking his pistol, waiting for the order to execute them. Beatrice felt a cold spike of panic, her body instinctively moving to shield Silas. But Silas remained perfectly rigid, his pale blue eyes wide, his head tilted slightly to the left. He wasn't looking at the guns. He was listening to the echo of Arbuthnot's boots on the damp stone, measuring the distance, calculating the angles of the confined space. "You brought a gun to a fight in my house, Thomas," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver down Beatrice's spine. "But you forgot one fundamental truth. You belong to the world of light. Out here in the deep earth, I am the king." Before Arbuthnot could comprehend the warning, Silas's left hand shot out with explosive, violent speed. He didn't lunge at the men. He struck the glass globe of the lantern in Beatrice's hand, shattering it instantly. The flame died in a fraction of a second. The chamber was instantly plunged into a suffocating, absolute pitch-black darkness, so thick it felt physical. "Cobb, shoot him!" Arbuthnot screamed, his cultured facade instantly shattering into pure, unadulterated panic. Blinded by the sudden absence of light, Arbuthnot fired wildly into the void, the muzzle flash illuminating the stone walls for a split second, revealing nothing but empty air where Silas had been standing just a moment before. Cobb fired 2 shots in rapid succession, the deafening roars of the pistols shaking dust from the ceiling, but the bullets struck nothing but solid limestone. In the absolute dark, Silas was a ghost. He didn't need eyes to see his enemies. His thinsulate-thinned ears tracked the frantic sliding of their leather boots on the wet stone, the desperate rasp of their breathing, and the frantic clicking of their weapon cylinders. Moving with a terrifying predator-like fluidity, Silas stepped behind Cobb. With a sickening, resonant crack, his heavy hickory cane swung through the darkness, fracturing the enforcer's knee. Cobb let out a guttural scream of agony, collapsing heavily to the floor, his revolver skittering across the stone. "Where is he? Where is he?" Arbuthnot shrieked, his boots slipping in the spilled gold coins as he spun around, blindly waving his gun in the pitch blackness. "I'm right here, Thomas," Silas's voice whispered from the darkness directly behind the banker's ear. Before Arbuthnot could turn, Silas's massive, calloused hand wrapped around the banker's throat, slamming him violently against the iron door of the vault. The revolver clattered away into the dark. Silas squeezed his fingers, burying deep into Arbuthnot's expensive linen collar, cutting off his breath as the banker thrashed desperately against his unyielding grip. Beatrice crawled across the cold limestone floor, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of Arbuthnot's dropped revolver. She grabbed it, cocked the hammer, and stood up, her voice ringing with pure, unadulterated steel through the black room. "Don't move, Mr. Arbuthnot," Beatrice commanded, aiming the weapon into the void toward the sound of his choking gasps. "The dark belongs to us now." The suffocating darkness of the limestone icehouse slowly surrendered to the gray, pristine light of a Montana dawn. The violent mountain thunderstorm had finally passed, leaving behind a profound silence that was broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from the stone ceiling. Silas stood unmoved, his heavy boots planted firmly on the floor, while Thomas Arbuthnot remained pinned against the iron vault door, his face pale and his breathing shallow under the blind man's unyielding grip. A few feet away, Cobb lay groaning in the shadows, his shattered knee preventing any hope of escape. Beatrice held Arbuthnot's silver-plated revolver with a steady hand, her eyes locked on the entrance of the subterranean chamber, as the heavy echoing thud of law enforcement boots resounded down the limestone steps. "U.S. Marshals! Nobody move!" A booming voice commanded as a squad of armed men in heavy canvas dusters flooded the vault lanterns raised high to cut through the remaining shadows. At the front of the line was Marshal Federal Deputy Federal, a stern man with a silver star pinned to his vest. He took in the scene with a mixture of shock and professional detachment. The notorious smooth-talking local banker caught red-handed in a secret vault surrounded by split wooden crates overflowing with solid gold eagle coins, raw silver bullion, and glittering sapphires. Beatrice lowered the revolver, her shoulders finally dropping as she exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for days. The omniscient perspective reveals the hidden brilliance of Beatrice's strategic planning before she had even set foot on Loxley Ranch that stormy night. She hadn't just run blindly from her cabin after Arbuthnot's extortion attempt. She had stopped at the town's small telegraph station using her knowledge of federal banking laws to draft an urgent, encrypted wire to the territorial governor's office in Helena, utilizing her late father's old political connections to bypass the corrupt local magistrate who was in Arbuthnot's pocket. The U.S. Marshals had been riding through the night tracking the banker's fraudulent land transfers for months, and Beatrice had just handed them the smoking gun. "Thomas Arbuthnot, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder," the marshal declared as his deputies roughly pulled the banker away from Silas and slapped heavy iron manacles onto his wrists. Cobb was dragged out behind him, his criminal career effectively ended by a blind man's hickory cane. As Arbuthnot was escorted up the stairs, he turned to glare at Beatrice, his handsome face distorted by a manic, desperate rage. But Beatrice didn't look at him. She looked only at Silas, who stood quietly in the center of his grandfather's recovered empire. The fallout from that night fractured the corrupt foundations of the Bitterroot Valley. Over the next few weeks, federal investigators dissected the books of the Oak Haven Bank, uncovering a massive web of deceit that reached across the state line. Arbuthnot was sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor in the federal penitentiary, his stolen wealth forfeited to pay back the honest homesteaders he had defrauded. The fabricated documents claiming Silas's financial ruin and mental incompetence were legally incinerated by a federal judge. With Alistair Carrington's gold securely deposited in a legitimate treasury, Silas instantly became one of the wealthiest and most influential land barons in the Pacific Northwest. When the hypocritical high society vultures of Boston heard of Beatrice's sudden spectacular fortune, they flooded her mailbox with perfumed letters of apology and invitations to return to the gilded parlors of the East. Beatrice read them all by the warmth of the Grand Lodge's fireplace, smiling quietly before nabbing each letter and tossing it into the roaring flames. She had found a deeper, truer reality in the rugged mountains of Montana than she had ever known in the artificial ballroom society of her youth. 6 months later, the spring thaw transformed the Bitterroot Valley into a breathtaking paradise of emerald green pastures and blooming wildflowers. The dark, neglected timber lodge of Loxley Ranch had been completely restored, its windows sparkling in the sunlight, and its fences standing strong and white against the horizon. The northern pastures were no longer silent. The air was thick with the healthy lowing of record cattle herds managed by honest cowboys who were paid a fair wage. On a brilliant Saturday morning, the small timber chapel in the center of the valley was packed to capacity with townspeople, homesteaders, and cattlemen who had come to witness the wedding of the century. The interior smelled of fresh cedar, white roses, and mountain pine. Silas stood at the altar looking magnificent in a tailored black frock coat, his dark hair brushed back and the faint scar on his temple now a badge of survival rather than shame. He stood without his cane, his broad shoulders squared, his sightless pale blue eyes turned toward the heavy oak doors of the chapel. He was waiting, his ears filtering out the murmurs of the crowd to focus on the single rhythmic sound that mattered. The heavy doors opened and a collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Beatrice stepped into the aisle wearing a simple, elegant gown of cream silk that accentuating her aristocratic beauty. She carried a bouquet of wild lavender and mountain clover. She walked with the same fierce, independent grace that had brought her across the continent, but her eyes were fixed entirely on the man waiting at the altar. As she reached his side, the minister began the ancient vows, but the true ceremony was happening in the silent communion between the bride and groom. Silas reached out his large, calloused hand into the space between them. He didn't hesitate, and he didn't fumble. His fingers found hers with an unerring, perfect certainty that rose directly from his heart. As Beatrice slid her hand into his, she felt the warmth of his grip, a silent promise of permanent protection and mutual respect. Silas could not see the cream silk of her dress, nor could he see the radiant smile that touched her lips, but as the scent of lavender drifted over him in the warm chapel air, he knew exactly how beautiful she was. He had spent 5 years buried alive in a self-imposed prison of absolute blackness, believing his life was over. But this fierce, independent woman had walked into his darkness using her sight to read the hidden truths of his past, while he used his strength to protect her from the wolves of the present. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and as Silas leaned down to press his lips against hers, the church bells pealed out across the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the Bitterroot Valley. The journey that had begun in the ruins of betrayal and financial annihilation had found its ultimate completion on the wild frontier. They had confronted the absolute dark together, and in doing so they had discovered a brilliant, unyielding light that would guide their steps for the rest of their days under the big sky of Montana.